Great. Well, let's get started then. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This is our third session and final session of this Urban Thinkers Campus. And for those of you who haven't been here for the first sessions, the purpose of this Urban Thinkers Campus is to look at climate change action in planning schools, and particularly to raise the profile around what is being taught in planning schools around climate change, to enhance our discussion about that, and to think about what are some of the challenges that we're facing, and to also understand more about how much is being taught and whether this is something that's growing. So I think we've had some very interesting discussions. The opening session was really, really good, and we had three presentations. We had Bruce Stiftel talked to us about some of the major challenges of integrating climate change into planning education. We had Schwab Luasa, who talked to us about about the skills and capacities and knowledges that are needed for planning graduates. A very interesting presentation on that. And Andrea Frank also talked to us about professional accreditation and certification, sort of the pitfalls of that. And I think she was saying that perhaps we shouldn't wait for that and we need to move forward anyways. And then we had some regional sessions, and that was mostly last week, and I think there was a final regional session on Africa that happened yesterday. So we're very keen to hear back from all of those hosts of the regional session, to hear what happened in your regional session, what you discussed, and what you found out. I was part of the European one, so we'll be reporting on that. And so that will be the majority of our session. And we're also we're also very happy to have Bernhard Barth here from UN-Habitat, and he's actually going to open our session. Before we talk about the feedback from the regional sessions, he'll be giving us some reflections from UN-Habitat on the questions of planning, education, and climate action. And he works in the Climate Change and Urban Environment Unit of UN-Habitat and is based in Japan. So what I'd like to do, we have about 2 hours for the session. I'd like to open with Bernhard's reflections, first of all, as he's not able to join us for the whole session. He's traveling today and has a lot of things going on, so appreciate his time in the beginning of the session. And then I'd like to move into having the feedback from each of the teams, the regional teams, and then we'll have some reflections at the end from Richard Sliuzas, who's been our host of this Urban Thinkers Campus. So Bernhard, I give you the floor, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, and apologies for this clash in schedule that hasn't really happened for the last 20 months or so, that travel interfered with an online session. But okay, we're slowly getting back to that. But maybe thanks also, for framing it the way you have. I'm certainly not going to provide you with opening remarks, but just really try to reflect on climate education for planners, or integrated planning education that very significantly integrates climate thinking. But before I do that, I have, of course, a few words of opening, and just to really say how delighted I am to be here. Normally, my colleague Stephen is engaging in this, but he's also traveling, and he is, I think, airborne now or at the airport, so for him even more difficult to join. But I'm excited because, of course, I've worked with some of you, many of you, in the past, exactly on that issue of planning education. That's now going back to more than 10 years ago, and just before we started this meeting, Mario and I just spoke for a few seconds on this, we're picking up some of the issues that we've discussed more than 10 years ago. And so great to be here. Obviously, a lot of progress has been made, but it's also very clear that there are still a lot of challenges. I would like to frame my thoughts maybe in the context of UN-Habitat's work over the last year. Also, I've just come back from COP, so frame it really in terms of the bigger climate change dynamics, climate action dynamics, and how the urban sector needs to contribute to that. And of course, planning and more broadly, urban education, of course, needs to provide the technical skills for that. So I think from our perspective here in UN-Habitat, you know all of the figures, 70% of greenhouse gas emissions come from cities. It's very clear that urban systems are particularly vulnerable. Urban infrastructure is vulnerable. And of course, from our perspective, the urban poor are amongst the most vulnerable to climate change. Urban dynamics are changing because of climate change. It's still difficult for many stakeholders to really engage on the urbanization, migration, climate change nexus. That's politically sensitive for some, but I think independent of the drivers of migration, climate change is certainly not reducing the pressure on cities. And so I think there are so many dynamics at play. And I think partly the same challenge that we face at the political level that is not fully recognized, how cities can contribute to the solutions. It's the same in planning and urban education, that this is still not as strongly integrated as it should be. So from our perspective here in Habitat, we have made climate change the cross-cutting theme this year. We focused really throughout the year. We've had many urban thinkers campuses on different climate-related themes. We've tried to build up our portfolio, but in particular Urban October with World Habitat Day, which focused on mitigation, World Cities Day, which focused on adaptation, and then of course the Innovate for Cities conference that many of you have engaged in on thematic themes, but also in particular on the theme of planning education. So I think that's been really important and certainly very much appreciated given the context that we're in. Maybe to then go a little bit more broadly to COP, I've mentioned already the World Cities Day, which happened to be also the day that COP started. So we did celebrate not only the global event in Egypt, but also in Glasgow directly, and of course around the world. And there are some, I think, very fortuitous coincidences in play. COP is, of course, the next venue, as Egypt is the next venue of COP27. So that World Cities Day was celebrated there, provided for the opportunity to lay the roadmap, but then I'll get back to that, but just bear that in mind for the next minute or so. At COP27, at COP26, UN-Habitat did engage to quite some extent, but we've had a much smaller footprint than in previous years. But the cities and local governments, associations, the whole constituency of local government and municipal authorities had a very strong footprint there. whilst education wasn't a top issue, but it did come out again and again that capacities in cities are lacking. So I think there is also a momentum there in terms of the demand side on the cities and the broader urban stakeholders. So I think to move now to COP27, we've had meetings with a number of housing and urban development ministries at COP26. We've spoken with the Prime Minister at the World Cities Day celebrations in Egypt. So I think there's a very strong engagement. We are planning now a much more comprehensive world, where the cities and regions and built environment day at COP. We're looking at an urban ministerial there. We're looking at all kinds of plenaries and panel discussions, and maybe this is, I'm getting ahead of myself, this is part of the presidency to decide, but I would certainly be very keen to look at the capacity development side of things and the engagement of planning schools in there as well. And of course, capacity development through the Nairobi Work Program is a very important mechanism for the COPs. We're looking also at a roadmap towards the next COP, and maybe I'm a little bit focusing too much on this, but it's really, I think, related to the global engagement that I see planners for climate action and the planning schools to also engage in. We have now a number of regional urban ministerial meetings, maybe a little bit too late to engage in that. But of course, the World Urban Forum is a critical event. Certainly extremely keen on working together, starting more or less in the next few weeks and months to see how we can integrate the climate change dimension of planning education, not just as one or two events, but linking that to all of the events that we have in terms of climate change. And I think to really move this agenda forward that we have been at for the last 10 years, it's really important to talk not only to the converted, but to the entire urban community. Maybe just to move back a little bit now to my work at the country level, where of course I do constantly look for planning professionals with climate change experience. And just to give you a sense of where from UN-Habitat I see this going, it's much more complex than just climate change. And of course, you're all planners, and I think nobody needs convincing that the integration of all social, environmental, economic issues can happen best at the city level. If the political environment is there, if the financing is there, if political will is there. But most of the projects that we are currently implementing just need to tick many more boxes than they ever have. We're planning much more long-term because of climate change. Every project somehow needs to contribute to the net zero targets. Every project needs to build resilient systems. Every project needs to build resilient communities. We're looking into livelihoods from the perspective of a just transition from a climate change perspective, but also from a fair COVID-19 recovery. We're looking at integrated planning from citywide action plans down to design projects that are fundable, that tick all of the boxes, and the planners need to somehow provide all of that. So it's not just climate change, but it's COVID recovery, it's innovative financing instruments that all need to be folded into this. So I apologize for taking a little bit longer, but those are just some of the reflections at the moment for the needs that we see, but also the roadmap ahead. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bernhard. That was very, very useful, and I think also I really like that you've highlighted this sort of integrated nature. I mean, one thing is about teaching around climate change and planning, but really what is needed going forward is better planning, more capacity to develop better cities and safer cities and resilient cities going forward, and those will all help around climate change. So thank you, and very very interesting to hear around that this could be, a big topic going into COP27 and over the next year. So we look for, hopefully we can collaborate on that. So thank you very much for that. Much appreciated. So I'd like to move on at this point to the regional feedback. And I'm not quite sure who is presenting for each one, so I'll just call on the region, and it would be lovely if you can please make yourself known as to who who is presenting. If you could keep your comments to maximum 10 minutes, that will leave us all more time for discussion afterwards. So the first one we have on the agenda is the Asia Pacific. I think it's Anna, but I'm not sure. Thanks.
And Mario, actually, and Mario, you're going to start off. So I'll just share our slides. Great, Mario. That we have.
Yeah. I would like to give an overview of the speakers who presented at the Asia Pacific focused session on Urban Thinkers Campus Spatial Planning Education for Climate Action. So we have shared, these academics shared their experiences, their challenges and lessons in educating planners for climate actions. So Dr. Anna Herleman from the University of Melbourne, organizer and facilitator, introduced the event and the speakers that were given 8 to 10 minutes. And after the presentation, there was a discussion. So the following are the speakers, country clockwise. So from Indonesia, we have Associate Professor Ruku Sitiadi from the University of the Diponegoro University. We have the next speaker is from the Philippines, myself, Professor Mari de los Reyes from the University of the Philippines, followed by China, Associate Professor Jing Gan from Tongji University. And then from China, we go to Hong Kong, Associate Professor Chow Ren from Hong Kong University. And then let's go to India, Professor Sanjukta Baduri from the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. And again, now we go to Australia. From Australia, we have Dr. Aisin Dedekorkut host from Griffith University, and Dr. Bush from the University of Melbourne. So Dr. Anna Herleman of the University of Melbourne will give the summary of the Asia Pacific session. So Anna, the virtual floor is yours, please.
Thanks, Mario. I just want to acknowledge that today I'm presenting this from Bunurong country in Victoria, in Melbourne. You can see Australia has many Indigenous country, and I just pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. So thanks, Mario, for introducing all our speakers. And from the map, you could see we have a really wide spread of speakers from a very diverse set of locations in the Asia Pacific. And so some of the key things, I'm just going to really summarize some key themes that we found. So really there were some differences in each of the locations, including a different climate change context and challenges. So Mario, in the Philippines, there's a lot of challenges that they were facing in terms of cyclones and storms and flooding. And in other areas like Australia, there was some flooding, but also in particular drought and bushfires. So each country had sort of different climate change challenges and different vulnerabilities and impacts that they were experiencing. So there was quite a bit of difference there. Also, we found that there were some differences in the language that we used in terms of describing climate change and climate change impacts, but also in describing components of education. So I think when we're going forward to discuss these issues a bit further with each other, we'll need to be mindful of those differences and come up with some key sort of common terms that we're using as well. So another key theme seemed to be a difference but commonality across the different contexts of drivers for including climate change in education. So in some contexts, there was a real strong theme of government policy influencing what was being taught in certain degrees. So the policy was driving, the need to include that in curriculum. From others, a driver was actually the university taking a stance on climate change and wanting to see some curriculum addressing it. In other contexts, it was accreditation processes for planning accreditation bodies of those degrees that were seeking greater input from climate change. But for others, it was individual interests and sort of understanding of the importance of climate change and including it in curriculum that was the driver. And for others, the international collaborations that they had and awareness and sort of that research education teaching nexus. So there were varied drivers and some commonalities across, and in many cases more than one driver for that education of climate change and planners. So another key theme was this discussion of the varied sort of knowledges that the students have and how should we pitch education. So there was some discussion about whether actually our primary and secondary education in our country should address climate change more, so we can delve deeper into sort of more planning focused issues. There was also discussion sort of within the university context of whether climate change should be a standalone subject or integrated across the curriculum, across subjects. And I guess as Bernhard just mentioned, climate change is cross-cutting now, and capacities that we need to address, the full range of planning issues. And the other issue was, should climate change be an elective versus a core subject? And so in different universities of people that were presenting, there were different ways in which climate change was included in the curriculum in the university. So there was a lot of difference there. There was also a strong theme of discussing, well, our climate change knowledge is growing, and therefore the ability to continually learn about climate change and grow our understanding and build that capacity for planners to continue learning is going to be really important. So that was another key theme. And just the last slide is just really we were thinking about, well, what the next steps will be. We certainly had a lot to talk about, and we could have probably gone on for a whole day or more. And we sort of set ourselves an aim to meet again before the end of the year and invite not only the panelists, but also all the participants who registered. We had about 70 people register. Not all of them came in the end, but we thought we'd send out an invitation to everyone for a less formal meeting where we could have a discussion session about the potentials for creating a community of practice. We had created a small community of practice in sort of the Oceania region, but we think there might be benefit in expanding that to the Asia Pacific area. And we could see potential for collaborating on teaching and particularly sharing case studies, and for our students to really gain knowledge of these different contexts and climate change challenges, and also potentially for research collaborations as well. So we thought we might meet to discuss, where we might go in those three areas as a starting point, and possibly to have a bit of a survey before that meeting to see where people's interests lie and gather a bit of data before that meeting to help shape the discussion. So that's all. Mario, did you want to add anything else? Have I missed anything?
I think no more. All,
okay, thanks.
All well said. Thank you.
Thanks, Mario. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Anna and Mario. I think it's quite heartening to see the different participants you had and from a wide geographical region. So I think that's really good, and sounds like you had quite wide-ranging discussions. So it looks like the beginning of something. So that's really good. Does anyone have any comments or things that they'd like to raise with them? Richard?
Yeah, thanks, Cassidy, and thanks, Anna and Mario, for the presentation. I was curious to know if there was some representation from the small island states at your meeting, or whether the specific issues that they are being confronted with, as they were very prominent voices, I think, at the COP meeting, and I think there's a growing concern with the future of many of these places. Was that something that was discussed?
It didn't come up in our presentation, but really, because we did set a time for each of the speakers, that time quickly evaporated. So we really, I guess that's why we wanted to continue the discussion over another day. When I look at registrations, I don't think there were too many from SIDS, but maybe we can proactively try to engage. Particularly, I think there's links with our New Zealand colleagues to many and small island developing states. So perhaps that's something we could really aim to improve on and engage with those communities more.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, I think we could engage them in our other webinars or workshops the next time.
Thanks. Nabil, you had a comment?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I need to close. Sorry, this is fine now?
Yes.
Well, I see the point of Richard. I think it's a really good point, the island nation. But in some sense, we are all islands. And I think it's not really, I think what really went deeply wrong in the COP26 is that they left those nations as they are the vulnerable bodies, and we will survive. We guys actually living in a proper continent, we can survive. I think this is deeply wrong. It's really all about us. It's everywhere. So I see the point, but I think it's we should. Our situation, I believe, for example, in Egypt, it would be equally the same like in the islands. It's life-threatening to every one of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Nabil, for your comment. And yeah, I agree. We can see that this is really affecting all places differently. Small island development states as well as other places. Andrea posted a point about perhaps presenting findings at the World Planning Schools Congress in Bali. So I don't know if we have plans to do that, but it sounds like a good idea. Richard, was that an old hand or a new hand?
No, it's a new one. I mean, I can respond to both points, I think. Was it Nabil's point? I fully agree. I mean, I wasn't suggesting that we need only to talk about small island states. I mean, there are, of course, many coastal areas, and it's not only coastal areas, are being affected by climate change and need various responses. Everybody should be part of the discussion. And just in relation to the World Planning Schools event, indeed, Andrea, that's a good point, and it was something that will be mentioned at the end of this. So I hope that we will be able to congeal again and maybe even meet face to face and spend more time together on this topic. Yeah.
Great. So let's move on to our next group, which is the Latin American group. I know we have Juan here. I don't know if you're planning on speaking on that group's behalf, but that'd be lovely if you could give us someone could give us a rundown of what happened in your meeting. I'm very interested to hear.
Sure, of course, I'll be delighted. I do have a small presentation. Can I share my screen? Okay, we did have a regional session on November the 10th, and it was great to have more participants than expected. So I will talk a little bit about how it went, the session, and then some consideration for what we call a co-creating an agenda. So this was the call for participating, and we set 3 main goals: the identification of innovative practice in planning curricula on climate change teaching, the strengthening planning faculty on climate change knowledge, and the co-creation of a research agenda on planning for climate action. Like I said, we had a good amount of participants, 48 registered attendees, most of them were there. So we had participation from 8 countries: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And we also had 7 program presentation from Chile. Jonathan Barton talked about Chilean scholars developing a research on climate change in cities, which also served as a basic input for a national strategy that was presented at COP26. Then Carolina Rojas presented a research conducted during COVID-19 pandemic, where she found that local community groups spontaneously developed initiatives to overcome the situation. Then we have a presentation by Libertad Zavala, and how planners should understand mitigation and adaptation actions proposed in metropolitan plans for climate action, such as the PAC Metro, an initiative that was presented in COP26 that focused on metropolitan governance for climate change. Then Maria de Lourdes Flores from Puebla in Mexico presented a research project in which students and professors work together with local grassroots groups. Cynthia Gonzalez, also from Puebla, talked about the urban heat islands as a mean of to understand climate impacts. Then Pablo Sierra from Uruguay talked about interdisciplinary approaches to climate change adaptation, a project called Adapta, and how it is possible to learn sustainability to address climate change. And finally, from Guadalajara, myself, I talked about the studio course under the umbrella of collaborative agreements with local governments and private sector, which it resulted in quite a nice product. So we, at the discussion, we had several points that were and need to be highlighted. It is a natural interdisciplinary subject that could be addressed, increasing inequities in cities, such as a climate justice approach. Also, there is a sense of a need to have a specific course on climate change in order to have it permeating the curricula and getting all of the faculty involved in it. But we also agree that it has to be a cross-cutting issue, and it should be addressed in different courses. Could be addressed as a studio course, an interdisciplinary workshop on planning in uncertainty, for instance, under the umbrella of issues such as risk and disasters, which could also explain concepts such as urban resilience. we think that the market is already demanding these skills from the government's commitment, and the private sector also committed in some points to addressing climate change. Climate change is also started for policy making, so the involvement of research and students with the public sector is crucial also. About barriers and opportunities, we think there is a lack of faculty training on climate change and sustainability issues in general, that cross-cutting knowledge is still a challenge to be addressed in our universities. The old silos working, it's still there, unfortunately. Institutions respond to how problems are built at the time, but the interdisciplinary spaces can help work these structures that can be sometimes very rigid. There's a poor lobby of universities with public entities to receive government support, so this explains a lack of funding for some projects. The Latin American cities require professionals who challenge the status quo. And we think that if it is not addressed promptly, this lack of climate change knowledge in the universities, there's a risk in training students to implement instruments and standards that are already obsolete. About strengthening and expanding attention to climate action in urban and territorial planning education. Promoting dialogue among institutions and countries with a focus on the region. The possibilities for this, well, this will help to promote the addition of climate change in curricula or in at least some courses. The possibilities for integrating the climate changing curriculum based on existing courses, we see that it's fundamental. Strengthening collaboration and exchanges between teachers and students around common problems in Latin America. Promoting links with local institutions for collaborative work. Facilitating the participation of faculty members in decision-making and design of public policies processes to find a place to be part of the governance of climate. And we also see that there is a great opportunity for faculty to launch proposals since they play a more neutral role, which also transcends periods of administration. About the basic body of knowledge about climate change, we found the carbon and water cycles fundamental, the understanding of the impact of urban heat islands, the climate change adaptation in cities, understanding that there are the problems are very diverse. For instance, we have to address coastal cities, intermediate cities, metropolises, etc., etc. Climate justice, climate migrations are also critical in Latin America. The climate change must permit to other courses, again, it showed, and we need to have a specific focus on commitment from the individual family level to other areas in terms of environmental education. Finally, the consideration for co-creating an agenda. There are many published theses. We found that as an important asset in the region, because climate change have been addressed in several research projects in different universities. Teaching manuals for courses in specific topics, including mitigation and adaptation. We also realize that there are no generic recipes, and adaptation should respond specifically to places and communities such as municipalities. it is important to share methodologies for a practically approach to these realities. The analysis of policy documents within the region, national strategies, local plans for climate action, such as those presented at COP26 from different countries. And finally, professors could share experiences of teaching work in the field in a repository of good practices. And that'll be all. Thank you very much. I think it's this type of reunion and sessions are very important to the academia. And I think this regional session helps us to accelerate some processes that we've been already addressing at ALEUP. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Juan. That was a very nice presentation. And I think you seem to have covered a lot of ground in your session. So that's really good. And yeah, it looks like it was quite nice to have that sharing of practices. So this discussion, open discussion around sharing of practices seems to be, a really important aspect of this whole thing that we were doing and hopefully going forward too. Can I open the floor? Does anyone have any comments or questions on what Juan presented? Richard?
I don't want to hog the microphone too much, but but it's also good to have to get started, I think. One, yeah, great presentation. You covered such an enormous amount of ground. I don't know how you did it in such a short time. Nevertheless, I was wondering, within your group, one of the groups that is behind this Urban Thinkers Campus is the Planners for Climate Action Network. I mean, to what extent were the people who took part in your session involved in that, and even aware of it? Because I can imagine that some of them had maybe never even heard of Planners for Climate Action. And to what extent are people already, for example, using the repository facility, which is available for Planners for Climate Action? Was that something that came up in the discussion?
No, actually no. It's something that we mentioned, but it's not a resource that has been used much. Probably that'll be a good thing to do, promote these spaces and these resources that are already available. We talked about some resources that are available at some of the Latin American universities, but we didn't specifically talk about that one. So I think it's a good point to.
But do some of the universities who were present, they already have some facilities for sharing materials? Or? They
do, not just materials in general of planning issues, but there are several projects like the ones I mentioned that are already in those virtual spaces that they have. Yes.
True. Because one of the issues is going to be the language issue, right? Because P4CA, I think, is set up primarily as an English language.
Right.
I'm not 100% sure. Maybe others know differently.
Right. Well, the most faculty, I would say most faculty can speak in English, but for instance, the local repositories are in Spanish, and there are several efforts to publish in English in the Latin American region, but I have to say that it's still Spanish, the most used language for publishing in the academia.
And Portuguese, I guess. And
Portuguese, yes, of course, and Portuguese.
But I guess also important to have repositories in different languages too.
Right.
So that's really good. Anna, you had a point or something to say?
Thanks, Cassidy, and thanks, Juan, as well. I think it's a really great idea to develop the repository further, or an additional repository. And I think perhaps in different countries and even different institutions, we might have different barriers to doing that, and it might be worth exploring. Because in some universities in Australia, the university actually owns the intellectual property of the lectures and things, and also different permissions are required if we're recording sessions. So yeah, I think even just the logistics of being able to share openly will be useful for us all to learn from each other and work through those issues together so that we can make those resources more widely available. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Anna. Good. So let's move on then, and we have USA and Canada next. And yeah, thank you, Juan, for your presentation.
Thank you.
Hopefully we come back in a sort of group discussion later to things you picked up there. So let's go to, do we have a presentation for the Africa and MENA group? I see Dr. Loasa, you're here.
Yes, we do have.
Thank you.
Summary of our discussions. Yeah. Thank you very much, Cassidy and everyone. Our Africa MENA session only happened yesterday, so I've only tried to summarize the very rich discussion that we had for 1.5 hours. And we were 6 people. Forgot to include Bruce. Bruce joined later. We had some people who had registered, but we don't know why they were unable to join, a few of them, but were unable to join. So it was me, Nabil, El-Hadi, Abbas from Cairo University, Alphonse Kessie, and Regina also, Kessie, and Bruce Siftel. And we had a really rich discussion yesterday about what is going on in different parts of Africa. We had invitations also for some universities in West Africa and Southern Africa. Unfortunately, unable to join, but we have a sense of what is happening there. And each of us gave a 10 to 15 minutes intervention to kind of take a light touch stock take on what's happening in the planning education curricula, the content, the integration of climate change, different methods. And from all the presentations, I could summarize here that one of the things that was a really big motivation to integrate climate change in planning education in the various African universities is the existential climate threats. So there were quite a number of examples, like, for example, the Nile Delta, the sea level rise, the drought, and the flash floods really kind of compelled the academy to take action and respond, especially with livelihoods, tourism, and built-up environment infrastructure being threatened. They had to look for solutions to that compared to if no go decision is made from policy. And then a good number of us are also involved in advisory services to international intergovernmental agencies, national governments, and also city authorities. This came through from all the presentations. But the other driver and motivation is around the research collaboration. There's a lot going on cities and climate change in Africa with Global North institutions, academy, as well as between Global South. In Tanzania, for example, Kluva, which is well known with a huge database on the vulnerability in the Dar es Salaam region there. But then there was also this really direct question and call by the communities and different stakeholders, as explained by Abbas from Egypt, of what am I going to do if I'm going to lose my land to the sea? So how much do we know as planners about the impacts of climate change in cities? Like, for example, in the Nile Delta or in Kampala or in Ibadan through extreme precipitation. What the quest to understand also motivated a lot of academia to integrate climate change impacts knowledge into planning to try and look for solutions. And that informed the redesign and the review of curriculum, like Kluva, as well as University of Cairo. And it also was used to for advisory at different levels, as mentioned earlier. And then we took a little bit deep dive into the in-house stock take on course content. There's a variety of courses in undergraduate and postgraduate, undergraduate, some core courses on climate risk and the field of climate science, assessment, options analysis and methods courses, for example, for vulnerability assessments, identification of adaptation options in all the universities represented. And in the case of Egypt, something that really was a highlight was this window of opportunity for response. So take action and don't wait to discuss the curricula and then discuss the curricula later. And in that process, if you can identify low cost and low tech options for response, then it makes a lot of sense for integrating and mainstreaming climate action into the education. And in the case of Dar es Salaam, continuous professional development is something that they have always done to ensure that planners in practice are kind of refreshed with climate information, climate science, the impacts, and what kind of responses that they can integrate into the planning of the many cities that they are working with. So this diagram, I guess, for all of us who are on the 3rd of November, we saw it. So what the discussions yesterday added was this blue button here, that there's been a kind of pathway of integrating and mainstreaming climate action in planning education in Africa that is research embedded. So research as the driver and research within which you embed the teaching at postgraduate level. So PhD thesis, master's thesis on climate change impacts and solutions around many things like green, blue infrastructure and rethinking the codes in different sectors like the flood codes, the infrastructure codes in response to what is being experienced as threats in those cities. So in a way, the academy is also kind of very much getting integrated into the cities where they are placed and positioned. So we touched on the competences, and the highlight of those that came out very strongly yesterday were the interdisciplinarity, both the few steps that have been taken, but also the stepping up of interdisciplinarity across board. Critical thought, critical thinking for the students was very important. How critical are our students to integrate all these issues? And then also understanding the impacts and uncertainties and enabling also the practice from theory. So there was this issue about the integration of different knowledge domains within the planning education. We touched a little bit on the next steps, and we think there are many things to do, but this again is a high summary of some of the things we touched on. One is stepping up on the knowledge on climate impacts on cities, and the other is integration of scientific, local, indigenous knowledge, especially in view of the disjuncture between the planning education, what we teach the students, and the public sector. And again, the best example I think was Cairo, where the public sector is widening roads, but then there is climate action requires for adaptation, but also mitigation, to rethink the transit-oriented type of planning. And then the urgency, where again from Egypt, there is the academy has taken this window of opportunity to take action and not wait in order to identify the low cost and low tech kind of solutions. And one of the interesting things that we're suggesting as a next step is to continue with embedding teaching in research. So postgraduate research as a basis to drive the agenda of climate action in cities is something that is worth taking forward and stepping up to address the uncertainties and build resilience. But that has to be matched with continuous professional training and development. So short courses, a variety of them, tailored courses, where the university and the academy is part of the city management and administration with some kind of memorandum of understanding that can be done on a tailored basis. And that would also require as the next step to step up on collaborations between scholars, because it's important to embed the university into the locale with the municipalities, government agencies, stakeholders, civil society organizations, and all the other people. So I think that's what we discussed in a high summary, but some of my colleagues here that were part of the discussion yesterday, if there's anything I've left out, and they can chip in or chime in. Thank you. Back to you, Cassidy.
Thank you very much, Schwab. Would anyone else like to, from that group, like to say anything? Oh, sorry, Nabil. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm sorry for joining late. I'm Abbas El-Zafarani, one of the team of Africa, but actually I logged in using the same account of Dr. Nabil. So
Thank you, Basil. Go ahead.
So actually the discussion yesterday about Africa was very fruitful. I learned a lot of things from it. But now I'm trying to comment about something that one of the colleagues discussing the previous presentation about the language barrier. Usually we don't face the language barrier because most of the faculty and researchers in Egypt understand English and can read English very well. Undergraduate students, no, not all of them. So usually we teach in Arabic what we have read in English. But the problem sometimes goes the other way. We write in Arabic research, and we have a tremendous amount of work that is written in Arabic, and it's not available for the world. For example, we faced a problem about 12 years ago when the issue of the sea level rise threatening Nile Delta rose up. Some decision makers were thinking to stop the development, economic development in North Delta, because everything we will do will go underneath the sea. So we have made a research in our school, Faculty of Urban Planning, Cairo University, and we found that there is a solution. There's a lot of solutions, engineering solutions, planning solutions, and we can take some precautions while we are making development in this threatened area, but not stop development, because this will mean loss of jobs and actually a landslide in the value of the lands there. I've met some small farmers who are asking, now I've lost about 20% of the value of my agricultural land. Shall I sell it now before I lose it all to sea, or shall I do something else? And the research was conducted and we found out, no, you don't have to sell it. There are solutions on the local level. You can do it by yourself. Some of your neighbors has done ad hoc solutions by digging part of the land and filling another part. So the dig part is a fish farm and the other part is used as agricultural land conventionally after raising its elevation. And you will find the way. And the advice to the government, don't stop development, please take precautions like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and go ahead. This was published in Arabic and it was a game changer actually in the thought in Egypt. And we continued to develop. This is written in Arabic and some of our sources was in Arabic too. So the issue of language is bi-directional. Some of the countries which are non-English speakers don't have the access to the international literature. And the things that are written in Spanish or in African languages or in Arabic is not available to the rest of the world. So I think we can work on that. Everybody can have multilingual products, so all the world knows what are everybody doing elsewhere.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thank you for the comment. That's a very important one. I think it goes both ways, the language issue. I think I just wanted to say a thank you to Dr. Sliuzas for his presentation also. And we're very happy that you managed to meet your small group and to discuss some of these issues. And I think the interesting thing that was brought up both in Juan's presentation and in yours was around this sort of research-led teaching and this integration between research and teaching and how important that is. And how, perhaps even more in research, we need to integrate those teaching elements into it, whether it's, having young graduate students involved in the research or integrating it into other areas of our teaching. So that was very interesting. I think, Nabil, you have a comment, is that right? So you're on mute.
Sorry, again, thank you very much, Shaib, for excellent presentation. And thank you, Abbas, of course, for your comments. I really like to emphasize this idea of experimentation that we are doing in Cairo. And part of it is that we invite, not only invite, we collaborate with scientists, with hydrologists. So I collaborate with hydrologists For some years now, I'm looking for a guy in the food sector to collaborate with. I think it's really important. And in a way, hopefully energy, but I think water and food is really great. That we've been learning a lot really from our collaboration on co-teaching with the scientists that is mainly a hydrologist. I think we've been learning a lot. He's doing more science. Again, climate change is a little bit different. Climate change science, a little bit different than planning. And I think it teaches us a lot. And if I may a little bit differ from the first speaker, that I would say what we do in Cairo University, we consider climate change as a framework for interventions, a framework that is in a way addresses economy, addresses society and community, addresses a whole host of issues. So I think, again, this is one thing that we've been learning from studying climate change. That is, for us, we are considering whatever a city or even villages or towns. We are not really, again, focusing on cities, only cities, as a social or socio-economic or socio-ecological systems. And this is actually very, very different in a way than a conventional planning approach. And we've been improvising. Again, we're doing research with the students, and we're taking the research step further, and we are eyeing real interventions. We are approaching the government for 1 or 2 years now, and hopefully will be successful at the end. And I think this is, again, because of the urgency. We talked yesterday about this urgency. We do have a very narrow window that we need to reverse the impact of climate change, or at least keep it at 1.5 degrees. And this is really a very short time. And if we would focus mainly on a conventional way, of reforming curricula, I think a lot of very, very valuable time would be lost.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's and I think making that point that Schwab had mentioned about not just curriculum but action, right? Is that the things need to be done now, and perhaps one of the best ways of teaching is in the moment and by taking action with different stakeholders and so some very good examples. Thank you. Is there any other comment about this? Anything we've raised? Otherwise, we'll move on to our group. We'll move back to the US and Canada group.
We ran our session on the 11th of November. And in that session, we started off with a review of the previous research that we've carried out in Canada and the US. And in that research, which comprised a content analysis of university calendars, as well as a survey of planning directors across the US and Canada, we had a number of findings, which I'll share with you now. And that kickstarted the conversation that we had in the session last week. Clearly in our research that we found that there's widespread acceptance of the reality and impacts of climate change, but considerable variation in climate change curricula and source of information. Often climate science in particular was delivered by allied departments, not so much planning programs, but by other disciplines and other departments, such as geography in particular, was quite prominent. We found that adaptation and mitigation subjects were commonly covered, as was resilience to natural hazards. And this is very much, something we saw across the planning program systems in the US and Canada. But there were a few dedicated planning courses that focus explicitly on climate change, which is interesting. I think we're hearing that from the other presentations as well. Instead, climate change education is delivered through integration in other planning courses. So it's treated as a cross-cutting theme in many cases, which I think is completely valid too. Now, the previous research also flagged the need to acknowledge and address the importance of social equity and environmental justice as key and high-profile themes related to climate change, and these are emerging in the curricula. There's and when it comes to who's advocating on behalf of climate change education, it tends to be from students themselves, undergraduate and graduate students, and from faculty, followed in priority by the program itself, and then by the college and the university. So individuals, program, college or faculty, and university would be the order of advocacy importance. We found in our research that climate change education is delivered through lectures and studio projects, workshops, but with a focus on learning by doing and problem solving, which is something you'd expect in a planning program anyway, but it's reflected in climate change education too. And finally, a big factor was external incentives to enhance climate change oriented curricula from program accreditation criteria, such as the PAB in the US, the Planning Accreditation Bureau, and the Professional Standards Board in Canada. So there's lots of progress underway in that regard. Now, we went to the day 2 session, and in that session, we posed several questions to frame the discussion. What should be taught? Who needs what knowledge, skills, and how should that be delivered? And so in that conversation last Thursday, we had the perspectives of planning PhD students, but we also had planning practitioners and faculty from the US and Canada represented in the session as panelists. And we had, of course, therefore, we had a nice blend of education providers and clients. And in that conversation, there are several key points that came out for discussion. And that included that we seem able now to move beyond a reasonably solid base with regard to climate change science. It seems generally covered in accessible curricula, although the coverage is still quite uneven across the system in the US and Canada. Without question, there's a need to acknowledge and address the issue of equity and justice aspects of climate change. And these are considered high priority issues, especially with regard to the needs of Indigenous communities in both countries. We found in the conversation that, well, climate change, as I said, is covered in dedicated courses or as cross-cutting themes. Both are appropriate. In fact, it's worthwhile having both approaches in a planning program. And we also felt that interdisciplinary approaches to curriculum design and delivery and research were considered essential. And that makes a lot of sense too, of course, because most planning programs in the US and Canada do take interdisciplinary approach to education and training. But it was also noted that it really would be advantageous to have opportunities for mutual learning between disciplines, between the academy and the profession, and between planning and allied disciplines and professions. So this whole idea of collaborative learning, mutual learning, sharing of information. This is a theme that's come across in our conversation this morning so far too. Continuing on with our conversation review from last week, we flagged opportunities to pool and share learning resources among universities and across campus. And this was considered very helpful, especially for smaller programs, noting that really the majority of planning programs in North American universities are at the master's level, and they're in departments of 5 to 7 faculty members. So these are small operations that that would really benefit from collaboration with other programs across the country. There's also a need to acknowledge the demand for a training role for planning programs through continuous professional learning or professional development. This has been flagged by colleagues today as well. So we have a role in helping build capacity in the profession. And this is especially true for planning professionals who are working in smaller places or remote places who simply don't have access to universities. So online education as well and training opportunities are fundamental. I think we have a really important role to play in that as university planning programs. We recognize the need to explore climate change impacts in the context of global North and South, which I think is appropriate, of course, so reaching beyond the American or the Canadian perspective to have a more of a global perspective. And we also acknowledged and incorporated perspectives of Indigenous peoples where appropriate. That was something, as to the greatest extent possible, I should say. in our curriculum, and acknowledging and integrating as well traditional knowledge when we teach about climate education. It's not just Western or scientific knowledge. It's also complemented by Indigenous perspectives on nature and the environment and the impacts of climate change. We also felt that plan evaluations considered an essential aspect of professional practice generally, and through using plan evaluation models and processes, that could be an effective way of examining and assessing performance of climate change interventions that we espouse and carry out in our plans, policies, and programs. And that's really the roundup of our conversation. I had a very nice PowerPoint presentation for you, but didn't come through today. I apologize for that. But those are the key findings from last week's session. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks, Mark. Sorry about your PowerPoint there. Thank you very much, though, for telling us what you discussed, and it seems some very interesting issues there, and especially on like small programs and needing to pool resources across. Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to build a little bit. One of the things that I thought was really interesting about the conversation is that it had in practitioners, and some of the perspectives they bring were a little different than the faculty we've been talking to for the last year. In particular, some of the things that came up was the ongoing dilemma we have in planning education about trying to get technical information, but also managing knowledge of process and working with power and those issues, and that there really needs to be more attention paid to the sort of real politic of how we go about working with policymakers in order to get our plans made and then implemented. And so I thought that was an interesting point. There was also this really good discussion about decolonizing our curricula so that we do a better job of having diverse literature in our readers and our practices. And overall, just this sort of idea of managing the process so that we have better engagement and we know how to overcome adversity and fundamentally sort of be in the room where decisions are made, trying to practice. I'm not sure exactly how we do that education, but I just wanted to bring forward that was an interesting perspective that we heard in this session.
That's right. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was just wondering, either Mark or Elizabeth or anyone, basically. I mean, you brought in the importance of listening to, engaging with Indigenous people, which is an issue I know in Canada and the United States, but it's not only exclusive there. It's in various places in Australia also, for example, but not only there. Also, are there good examples of maybe people, scholars with an Indigenous origin, you could say, who are engaged in this or pushing these issues, or examples where we see that the perspective of Indigenous peoples have been crucial in instigating change for the better in relation to climate action?
I'll start off, if you don't mind. I think we're seeing in at least the Canadian side, a lot more attention being paid to this issue in all planning programs, and many are hiring faculty who are either Indigenous and or have an Indigenous perspective on planning matters generally. And so, and they're also starting to work in the climate change area too. So mostly we're the former, we have colleagues who are working on Indigenous planning matters generally, and we see great potential to also include a focus on climate change as time goes on. So that's very promising, I think, Richard.
Thanks, Richard. Any other comments on the?
Or maybe Anna, yeah. I don't know if Anna's still awake. She's with us from Australia. So.
Oh, there she is.
Yeah, I guess it's really interesting. I mean, in Australia, we've got such a small Indigenous population, and we're really trying to build our Indigenous scholars in universities, let alone sort of PhD. But I think there's increasing recognition of the importance of decolonising curriculum and including Indigenous knowledge in our planning education, because in particular in Australia, a key approach that Indigenous culture has is caring for country, and caring for country is key, you know, to climate change. So caring for the land and resources. And so, you know, there's a great understanding in our in many planning programs of the need to really increase our curriculum's coverage of Indigenous issues, let alone in the context of climate change. And so there are two things actually that the Planning Institute of Australia, who's our accrediting body, seeking us to all improve on in Australia. And that's, I guess, it's not just them that because we're doing it, it's because we as educators also see that this is really important. And as someone mentioned just then, our students are calling for it too. So yeah, but they're really important insights for climate change.
Mm-hmm. Good.
I think it's interesting, maybe not only just a different perspective on caring for the land, but a whole different perspective on like land ownership, right? I mean, property, the whole concept of property is very, maybe completely foreign in some types of communities.
And in Australia, thinking about the seasons, you know, we talk about 4 seasons, but in many Indigenous countries in Australia, they have, you know, 8 seasons and can describe them in great detail, and they're changing because of climate change too. So, yeah, there's so much knowledge that we, I think, can better know about and understand and apply it in our practices as planners. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Nabil? Oh, sorry.
Sorry again for the confusion.
Sorry, please go ahead.
You were talking about the issue of Indigenous people. Actually, there are great ideas that comes from, I call them spontaneous people, not only Indigenous, because some of the urban managers in areas of Egypt, rural areas, are not that specialized, and you can consider them Indigenous people. They are not that educated in urban planning or anything. And they have solutions. If we listen to them, we find solution. About 15 years ago, I visited a small city called Ras Al Bar. It's at the mouth of the River Nile, where it meets the Mediterranean. It's a peninsula between the Nile and the Mediterranean. And they were doing new plans and people building new villas and buildings. And I asked one of the managers, aren't you afraid of the sea level rise? He said, so what? Let it happen. What will happen if the sea rises by 2 meters? Okay, we are ready. We'll just fill the whole city with 2 meters of soil. And, how can that happen? The houses will be below the street level. Like, no. Now we have the regulations. Any new building, the ground floor should be 2 meters above the street level. So if the sea rises, all the houses will be above that level. And they can use a basement. If it happens, they can fill the basement and we can fill the streets and raise our infrastructure a little bit. And we are ready for 2 centuries of sea level rise. Why are you afraid? That was, shocking for me at first. When I heard it, I rejected the idea and then said, well, maybe. How did you get this idea from? He said the people were talking to the governor. The governor is an architect, by the way. And when some of them said that idea, he got confused a little bit and he said, yes, this is correct. And he changed the regulations so everybody will have his first floor 2 meters above the street level. It is very simple. It costs almost nothing. And it came from the people. If somebody listens to the people, we can find solutions that as academic people cannot get it or will take a hard time thinking that straightforward, simple way to solve it. So it's both ways.
Yeah, thank you. Very nice point. I think it really chimes with the point that Elizabeth was making, which is, when they invited the practitioners into their discussion about climate change education, it changes the idea of what needs to be taught. And I think this is a really important point.
Is absolutely
is
right.
that in those integration between practice and teaching. Yeah, thank you. That's great. If you have any other comment, we might move on to the our final presentation, which is the one on Europe, please.
Yeah, right. Also in the European setup, we had a discussion on the 8th of November, and there are basically two parts in the discussion. First was a short presentation of the survey, which has been recently started and is still. The work is still ongoing, looking at planning schools in the AESOP network, and then we followed that up with a look at a couple of cases, both of which were Italian, but it was more a matter of coincidence than initial planning, but still very useful, as I think we will see. And then we had some breakout group discussions and talked a little bit about what would maybe come next. Right, so first the survey and the reflections. This was really, the idea for the survey was, I think, inspired by the work of Anna and also what Elizabeth and Mark and what I think have been doing in America and in Canada to try to dig in a little bit more into what's going on in the different European planning schools. So this is, we did the actual work with the help of many people, many of whom have come from the Young Academics Network, and that's of course greatly appreciated. We haven't been able to get into all of the information from every single planning school which is a member, but we've got a very large number. In total, we are covering 143 different planning programs, but with a total of about 413 courses. I think the survey initially included more, but we had to filter them out because some were not specifically on planning issues and for various other reasons. We have, of course, as others have seen, there is a mix of core and elective courses. I think in general, most of the courses being offered are elective courses. There is, though, when we tried to make a sort of assessment of how much of each of the courses was actually dealing with climate change, and it's actually generally very little, although it is a topic which appears in about, in many of the courses which are on offer. It's actually proved quite difficult to make estimations of this without talking to people who are actually involved in the programs, but because we've been using this online syllabi, but the trouble is, part of the trouble is that there's only about half of the courses which we can find some information on have a full syllabus available, so that makes it rather difficult. That's maybe something that is interesting to give more attention to, particularly for people who are interested to take up a planning degree of either undergraduate or graduate course, that access to information is really quite difficult in many cases. Nevertheless, of the 141, but above 143, but roughly 140 programs, about 91 have got core content on climate change issues, and 29 with only elective content, and some are a mix, of course. What we see that there's quite a lot of sort of efforts, I think, to mainstream climate change, but that's an issue I think which could be taken up more. 83 with 2 or more courses are dealing with climate change, and there's roughly 60 with only 1 course. And so there is a lot more room, I think, to do more on that, and I think that's one of the things that's been coming out quite clearly in the discussion today, also from other groups. What we saw, we also had a reflection from some of the people who were involved in the survey work from the Young Academics Network. And what we see is, one of the key things is that climate action is really a very super wicked problem, and it's not one that can be dealt with independently. I think we've heard that also, that I think it was Nabil was talking about the need to look at cities or think more of systems, a socio-ecological system approach, and to not isolate climate change as being something unique, but try to integrate it with other things. We also heard from the people involved in the survey that, because when they did that survey, we provided them with a number of keywords to look for, and maybe we were a little bit too limited in that, and so there was a thought that also would have been good to include other types of keywords like climate information, vulnerability, early warning, and a number of things more related to general disaster risk reduction might have captured a few more courses where there is also a climate component. We do see, though, a need to widen the scope of planners to integrate climate action in planning and policy making. There is some degree of competition also was identified as an issue, where not planning schools as such, but research institutes, think tanks are doing a lot of work in climate action, have a lot of knowledge about climate issues, but they often have zero knowledge on planning. So there might be a lot of benefit to try to link up planning schools with some of these specialist research institutes, think tanks, and to bring the planning component more into their work. And there is a need for more insights on the pedagogical aspects and detailed content, and having some in-depth interviews with some of the people who are really sort of pushing the climate action agenda within the different planning schools. So there is scope to do that in the future. We talked, we heard some presentations from two planning programs, one from Venice and one from Torino. I'm not going to talk too much about the specifics of them, but both of them have actually their origins in the early 2000s. They've in the Torino case, they established a specific course called Planning for the Global Agenda in 2017. And in Venice, they've established a program called Urban Planning for Transition, established in 2021. But both draw on a long history of various educational developments, research activities, networking. And both of them, I think, are very much like many planning programs, as we've heard, are very much built around or combining theoretical courses with this studio work, where there's a lot of scope for practical work, drawing from the theory, but looking at and trying to work out how that will can be brought into practice. There's a lot of collaboration with other universities, and there's a lot of collaboration with various municipalities, communities at various scales. So going from metropolitan scale down to very local levels. And I think if you are interested to hear more about those, you can find the information on our website for the Urban Thinkers Campus, and you can listen to the videos if you want. And of course, you can also contact the people involved in those two programs. Both of them are, I think, are very strong in their intercultural and interdisciplinary approaches in looking at conflict management, decision making, and linking theory to practice. A lot of good work going on there. But as I said, these were just two Italian cases, and there's a lot going on in other countries as well. We had a couple of breakout groups where we looked at barriers and knowledge gaps and core knowledge and skills, and a bit on pedagogy. Sorry, I always struggle with that word. On the barriers and knowledge gaps, there was a connection between climate change issues such as disasters and migration important. The way we frame things is important. And the point was made that maybe where a few years ago, the climate change discussion was strongly connected maybe to issues related to ecology and environment and species and the loss of glaciers, which are of course all important. It's gradually changing, and we see also a much broader discussion looking at the link to energy policy, building codes, designing and planning. Like we've heard from other regional sessions, there are still quite many teachers who are unprepared to teach about climate change. They probably have thought about it, but they don't necessarily deal with it in any way in their own courses, where there might be opportunities to do so. We saw that it's quite difficult sometimes to connect the classroom teachings with the real world issues of climate change. But developing those links is extremely important. Also, developing the knowledge amongst the students on how to work effectively in interdisciplinary teams. And we see that the knowledge gap, part of the knowledge gap, could ultimately perhaps be solved by integrating the perspective of climate change impacts across the curriculum, so a more of a mainstreaming approach. I personally, what was mentioned was maybe the possibility earlier was the possibility to have one or two core courses, but then supplement those core courses, I think, with things which are dealing, where there's a more mainstream, where you try to connect everything that we're doing almost within the planning curriculum, at least touch on the climate change implications and the implications of climate change for that particular topic. There was one other thing I was going to mention, but it slipped my mind. It will come back probably. There was another breakout group looking at knowledge, skills, and pedagogy. The sense of urgency, which is again something which has been mentioned, and also that agency matters. The little quote that I made at the opening session, it's too late to be pessimistic, we have to act. And that we can start to make a difference, maybe even withstanding the seemingly overwhelming blindness that we might be confronted with. I mean, the example that was just pointed out to us, how we can benefit by talking to people locally, by getting them involved, opening up the discussion a little bit. In terms of pedagogy, the importance of studio work, I mean, look at the cases that were discussed previously. It's important to also look at what are the crucial competencies for realizing changes. And I think changes which have to be quite transformational, even if they are only incremental. I think there's a new book coming out at the end of this month, if I believe, on my birthday, on the 26th of November, which is called Transformational Planning. I guess I hope there will be a lot of interesting ideas and suggestions in there for how we can do that. And there are examples of interesting approaches, not just sort of traditional studio work maybe, but challenge-based learning, where you try to actually base the studio around a very specific problem that a local community may be dealing with. And this need, as has been pointed out elsewhere also, linking research to the project work and to the education in the studios and theoretical classes. With that, I'd like to thank everybody who participated in the discussion, in our regional discussion, and I'll hand the mic back to you, Cassidy.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Richard. That's quite interesting that you've brought up. You can stop sharing your screen if you could, please. That's quite interesting that you've brought up a lot of things, I think, across, like, around this integration, you know, with practice, around being in the field. There's a lot of things there that are quite similar across the other presentations also. Thank you. We all know your birthday now. We'll remember to hopefully wish you a happy birthday on the 26th. So just some final comments. I think Bruce raised something here, which is it possible, Nabil raised something around, Bruce raised around what could P4CA do to facilitate collaborations. Nabil says helping advise governmental planning authorities like Egypt or African cities. Yeah, I mean, I think there seems to be a big difference, and maybe this is around global South, global North, around the imperative or the ability to connect this to real world problems. And certainly in Egypt, as in Dar es Salaam, you know, these are really things that communities are dealing with on a daily basis. And so this connection is very easy. In fact, if you just step into the street, you can see it. Whereas in other cities, that's more difficult. Any final comments here? or Bruce, do you want to come in?
Sure. It's just I kept hearing through so many of the presentations that this issue is so urgent. We don't have the time to do what, as faculty, we like to do, to study something first and consider and collect evidence and debate and then decide on strategies. And with climate change, we all know that the decade of decision is upon us. We've got challenges that have to be met within the next 5 years, 8 years, 20 years. And we don't have the luxury of that model of study first, act later. And repeatedly, folks have had interventions that have said the way to short circuit this includes having to consult and collaborate with government, with NGOs, with other disciplines, with practitioners across planning programs. And so I'm thinking, and some of you have suggested P4CA could play a role there. And I'm trying to think, what can P4CA do most impactfully to address those kinds of collaborations and help them work better? And I appreciated Nabil's suggestion of what I might call SWAT teams to help in given instances, but I'm trying to think more broadly of how do we help those who are designing these courses and programs that are thinking about implementing these courses to learn from one another and from the others in this constellation.
Good, thank you. Nabil? And
Yeah.
Olafin, we haven't heard from you. I don't know if you have any comment to make in this last part. I'll come back to you in a moment. Yeah, Nabil?
Yeah, thank you, Bruce, very much. And thank you, guys. And my idea, again, is here, planning as taught in universities, I think in Egypt and in Africa and Latin America, in Global South. I don't really like very much Global South because actually we are now one planet. It's not, you cannot really divide. But the thing is, we have intensive Western influences. That is, people here in governments, in planning authorities are basing their decision upon, and they are very slow. So my idea is, this is my idea, if planners P4CA would help advise, bridge a gap, consult, discuss with local governments in some of our areas to show them that and convince and talk to them about the urgency, and we need to experiment, we need to allow more connection between research and education and implementation. There is really a lot of problems that cannot really wait. And if P4CA can really play a role, like really discuss with our governments, that would be fantastic. And it's not only about Africa again, it can be really global thing. It can be really, and it will not be really, I believe, one way. It will be two ways, because actually what happens here in Africa or in Asia or in Latin America would definitely impact people in Europe or in America or whatever. So I think it would be two ways, and definitely will be very good for all of us. So and I was really fascinated by the WHO. Yeah, what I was saying is, I really was fascinated by WHO approach to COVID. The fantastic guy, the Irish guy who led the emergency, was saying that we do intervene first and then do in parallel research and then improve our intervention. And hence, actually, we can really accelerate how we react, how we respond to this emergency. And I think there is really a lot to learn about what type of intervention planners or whatever during this, again, emergency, climate change emergency. And it is really far more impactful compared to COVID-19.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Olafin?
It's really interesting hearing about the different regions and the approach to integrating planning and climate change into planning in the universities and schools. And it's really one thing that the Planners for Climate Action is really, that's one of the things we established for, to be able to help and support in really integrating climate change into planning. From the discussions, I've noted down some few points, and I've noted the importance of local knowledge, and I've added that the Indigenous and local knowledge all together. I've also noted the importance of collaboration and consultation, and looking at the gap in practice, between practice and what is being taught in universities. And probably it's now time for us to be more practical and radical in the approach, as well as being creative in looking at how to involve practitioners in what's happening in the universities and informing the curriculum, in sharing experiences and practical knowledge and the procedures and the processes in which the knowledge are interpreted and implemented at both the local government level or the regional government level. And there is also that importance and the need for the continuous professional development for planners as well, because at the moment there's a shortage of planners globally, and we know that. And so it's kind of, how can they be equipped to also understand what's going on, the latest research, available knowledge on climate change, on climate science, and the different areas that have been mentioned. It's also important for practitioners to be aware of that as well, of the latest knowledge, and to be able to put that into use at the same time. So yes, it's been an interesting session, a very, very insightful one. And definitely, I think we'll go back to the drawing board in P4CA to look at what we can do best to really make sure that this continues. So
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll just wrap up the session. I think we have about 10 minutes left, and I'll give the floor to Richard. You also have your hand up, so maybe you have something else to say before that, but maybe you can put them all into one. And there's also a comment from Nikita you can all read in the chat, which is quite interesting. And maybe Richard, you might have the chance to address that too.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe before I do the wrap up, Cassidy, I was just thinking, because Andrea Frank is online and she's one of the editors of that book I referred to, the Transformative Planning. And I wondered if she might, she can just share a few ideas with us about what we can expect in that book and how much of it is maybe directed and of relevance to the discussions we're having now about climate action.
Great.
Just if you could do that briefly.
Thanks, Andrea.
Now you're putting me on the spot, and I left the book at home because I got a pre-early copy from the publishers. But we have one article on climate change, especially from Australia, looking at smaller communities and what they could do and how they approach it. So in terms of planning. In the book, it's also about thinking how we can transition. So a lot of theoretical chapters. There's 3 sections basically. There's one section on theories of transition and transformation, and offering frameworks. There's a set of chapters on education, but they don't particularly focus on climate change. They look at decolonizing. So that is a big theme, as well as bringing in the SDGs. So I think climate change comes in sort of sideways in a cross-cutting theme. And then there's a section on research. And there is something on circular economies, something on climate change and transport planning as well. So different kinds of sets from around the world. that we picked and that were suggested from the different regions around the world as dominant or sort of novel and really innovative, progressive articles on transformation and changing cities and rural areas into, you know, more sustainable, resilient living environments, trying to find sort of getting away from the common labels here. So I you know, I can recommend it, but it's not a focus per se on climate change, I have to say.
No, I thanks. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot as well, but I was glancing at it briefly this morning, just the table of contents a little bit and reading a bit on the intro, and I could see, I mean, because we've been talking about the need for transformative practices, and I think the whole idea of transformative incrementalism, I've been in discussions where people talk about radical incrementalism, or even incremental radicalism, if it's different, I'm not sure. But anyway, it's probably I think a lot of what we're discussing today is related to this thinking that we need to do things, and we need to do things differently, and have more impact. So perhaps your book or some of the things in it will be a stimulus to.
Yeah, I think there's, you know, a lot of working with communities and the local or indigenous knowledge, and bringing communities, you know, within or in the fold, and having them part of the process is probably part of several of the articles, as well as, you know, this whole living lab approach of, you know, doing and then in parallel evaluating what impact and change that what effects that have. So these are kind of new approaches that are emerging, and we're learning to deal with that, rather than sort of the sequential approach that Bruce described, that so was for decades or maybe centuries sort of the preferred academic approach. So it is perhaps embracing potentially quite controversial, and, you know, the question is it ethical that we experiment like we do a chemistry experiment, but that's not in a lab because we live in this lab. So it has real effects and on the people or impacts. And I think that's a big step change. But a reality that Nabil from Egypt was sort of talking about, that we might be forced into, rather than sort of saying, well, you know, let's try it all out, because we can't really try it out in a lab and then transfer it in the real world and then hope it really works like it does in the lab. There are too many factors. And so if we get, I think, the agreement of the people engaged in this experiment, I think then perhaps it's a fruitful and a much faster way forward.
Good, thanks. I'll leave it there. I'll let you off the hook, Andrea.
I'll shut up now.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen again briefly, and I'll just close off this final activity. If I get the right. You can share. You can see my screen. I'll just leave it the way everyone can see it. Yeah. Okay, just a few things to round off. I mean, and maybe just before I go through this final slide.
Richard, are you wanting it to show us your PowerPoint?
Not really.
Some chat.
This is easier because now I can see you.
Okay.
Thanks.
We're seeing your email, someone's email.
We see your Teams.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Then I'll make it a second.
If anyone has an answer for Nikita in the meantime, you can also type it into this question and answer
Yeah.
around the
Okay.
conservation of nature.
Two small things then. I mean, I like Nabil's call very much to what we can learn from the COVID experience of having more sort of real-time research monitoring processes interwoven with what we are doing in our lab work or in the experiments, maybe if we are doing them. And also Olaf Fion's call for more attention for the local planners, because much of the work is actually being done, planning work is being done in small and medium-sized cities by people who are often very much under-resourced. And well, we heard about small faculties at universities with 5 to 7 people. In many small cities in many parts of the world, there might not even be a professionally trained planner. So maybe thinking about, I think there's some useful things that we might think about are how we can package resources that might help the people in those sorts of circumstances still make a difference, even though they may not be necessarily, essentially well equipped to do so from their previous education. Okay, well, firstly, I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed all of these different activities. I'm very sorry I haven't been able to attend everything because of all the other commitments, and but just what's going to happen next. Like all Urban Thinkers campuses, this one also has some requirements for reporting. So I've already started putting a report together. I think I will be reaching out to those, particularly to those people who were involved in the regional sessions, also to chip in and add their specific components to that. I'll try to do that as soon as possible. Hopefully we can get this the official reporting part wrapped up by the end of this month or early December at the latest, while things are still fresh in our minds. There are, of course, various things going on. We heard today about the survey, which was done in Europe, for example, and there's work being done in Australia and other parts of the world as well, US and Canada. This work is going to be finalized, and then we're looking for ways to share the findings of those different studies through various types of publications, and maybe some sort of joint publication. That's something that hasn't fully been decided yet, I think. We hope to promote the further collaboration around this topic through the various regional networks and planning school networks through Japan, of course. And just in that light, it was mentioned already, I think, on the chat, that we have the World Planning Schools Conference coming up in next year in Bali, together with the 16th Asian Planning Schools Association Congress. And there is a call out now for sessions, and I would advocate that we should try to bring in a session there on this related to planning education in climate action. I think that would make a lot of sense. I think the best birthday present you can give to me, other than the launch of the book that Andrea was editing, would be to make sure that you share all your presentations or any recordings that you made of the sessions that you attended or helped to organize as a regional group. Please send them to me, either via my email address or to Petra Weber, or send links if we can download them somewhere, and we will make them available via the main website for this event. And of course, Planners for Climate Action has been mentioned several times. Get involved if you're not already involved. Go to the website, have a look, maybe, and particularly as we're talking about education, look at what is already in the syllabus repository, what you might add to it, how it might be strengthened. Perhaps even thinking about adding some non-English language components to it. I'm not sure how that will be organized. And just linking up to the things that, one of the things that Bernhard mentioned, also there are other activities as well, the World Urban Forum, of course, of UN-Habitat, and the COP27. And there will be many other opportunities, I hope, to collaborate and to share resources. I think that's essentially it for me. A very, very big thank you to all the people who helped make this event possible in getting the support for it from UN-Habitat and the World Urban Campaign, but also all the technical preparations. Job Dome, who's been organizing all the sessions on Zoom, but everybody involved in the organizing committee, and especially those people who helped make the regional sessions so interesting and valuable. Please keep sharing, please keep talking and collaborating. Thank you very much. And I'll stop.
Great, thank you. And yeah, and thank you to you, Richard, who's proposed this and spearheaded this event. And thank you for all your efforts to bring us together. And yeah, I think Andrea's idea of the World Planning Congress is a great one. Yeah. Onwards and upwards. So thank you everyone for this. And if there are no further comments, I think we can close off.